Hi, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about design thinking. And before we get into that, I just wanted to talk about a few things that are coming up this week. We do have another discussion board. This week we only have two leaders, Leslie and Jacob. But keep an eye on that. I may also throw a third question in there for you to opt in and respond to. So the other things we have coming up this week, we've got your current situation analysis draft is due on Sunday by 5 o'clock. And then I'm also wanting to do mid-semester one-on-one conferences with all of you again. And so I will throw up a doodle poll where you can let me know about your availability for next week. And so we'll get those scheduled by the end of the week, hopefully. So let's talk about design thinking. This is a topic I'm really excited about sharing with you. Basically what design thinking is it's a process that has been borrowed from the product design world and applied to organizations for innovation and strategy. And it's definitely been gaining traction. Seeing a lot more and more organizations that are talking about this type of process. So I've been involved in two fairly significant strategy processes at the university over the last couple of years, where we employed at least parts of design thinking. And what I thought I would do for this week is tell you a little bit of the story of one of those in particular so that you can kind of see what design thinking looks like in practice. So I was 2 years ago, I was part of a team that was called the Strategic Planning Coordinating Council. That was formed by then President Roy Sengstrom to work on a new strategic plan for the University of Montana. When we started meeting in April of 2016, we had a great group, but none of us really had a whole lot of experience with strategic planning, and we clearly did not have a process in mind. I mean, we started early on gathering data, but we didn't know what we were going to do with that. I think what we did know early on was that we wanted to do something very different than what had done previously with the university's strategic planning. And in particular, we knew that we were interested in having a process that was very inclusive of a lot of people, very transparent so people could see what was going on throughout the process, and also a process that was very much driven by data, informed by data. And so as we started, I was aware of a couple of colleagues on campus who were involved in a leadership development program that was being offered through, it was a joint program between Arizona State and Georgetown University. It was called the Academy for Innovative Higher Education Leadership. And I knew that one of the things that they were engaged in as part of this leadership process was applying design thinking principles to strategy. And at that time, I really didn't know what that meant, but I was very interested in learning. And so I invited my colleagues, Claudine Cellier, who works in the provost's office, and Amy Kinch, who heads up our faculty development office. I asked them if they would come to our strategic planning group and share what they had learned about design thinking to see if it was a process that we might be able to use. So I remember the day that they came, and Claudine wrote this on our whiteboard. We had a little war room down in the basement of the Davidson Honors College. And she wrote this basically mind shift guide and to help us understand really the daunting challenge that was facing us. In one particular case, at the starting point, you start from a perspective of thinking about what your end users need, what their problems are that need to be solved, as opposed to the organization's problems. In design thinking, instead of having a small group of leaders sitting in a conference room making strategy, the idea is that you get out and you look at what's going on with the people who are engaged in your services, your products, and learn from them. We've talked about this, I think, before, that instead of the one and done, creating a plan that lasts over several years, you're really, in design thinking, you're continually ideating and learning from what you were doing. And so I know that all of the readings that we have for this week and a couple of the videos that I have shared. The word ideate, or I'm sorry, iterate, or iteration is part of that discussion all the way through. It's a critical part of design thinking processes. And then finally, the kind of the old way, traditional way of strategy was, once that group of leaders had created the plan, they then needed to communicate that with people and get buy-in from everyone who was going to be affected by it. So that's kind of that sell and socialize or promoting your plan. And in fact, I found this in my bag, a little memento from 2011, a pin when the President Engstrom rolled out his first strategic plan. That was rolled out with a big presentation in the Denison Theater, followed by a lunch where everyone got not only some free food, but they also got some literature about the plan and this pin that says, "Building a University for the Global Century, President Royce Engstrom, May 2nd, 2011. So that's kind of what the process used to be, where you would build this plan and then you would have to present it to the people that it was impacting. Very different view of that with design thinking, where throughout the entire process you're engaging with people. They are involved in creating the plan with you. They are involved in testing the ideas that you're working with. And so then when it comes time to execution of the plan, there's already buy-in. The people already understand what it's all about because they've been part of that process throughout. So we did adopt or make the decision to adopt a design thinking model to guide our process. In particular, you'll recognize this if you've done the readings for this week. The Designing for Growth book was one of the readings that this Leadership Academy did. And the way that they interpret this design thinking process is in these 4 stages: what is, what if, what wows, and what works. And so we really adopted this terminology and adopted these stages as part of our process. And I guess one of the things I would like to comment on before I move on is that I like the visual of this model because it very much mirrors what I talked about last week in terms of what a creative process looks like, in that it starts by doing divergent thinking. It comes to a close with some convergent thinking. And so you've got an opening period, an exploration period, and then a closing period. And then you move on to the next phase and you do that again. So this is what we adopted for the strategic planning process. We really started our what is phase in the summer. We did a number of things. This is a picture of a planning calendar that we used. But we started even in like June and July. We started reaching out to across the state and beyond to alumni. We did a survey of business leaders across the state. We engaged in conversations with government leaders at the state, county, and local levels. And then we also engaged with people at the higher education and the Commissioner of Higher Education's office. We sent a group over there to do a day's worth of interviewing with those folks. So we kind of saved the campus interaction until September, when people were back and ready to start school. And this kind of shows some of the things we did there. So some of our activities in terms of gathering information. Well, I guess I should say the other thing that we did during the summer that was a lot of work is that we gathered, I think, somewhere around 50 or 60 existing documents on campus that were pertinent to strategy. And so obviously the existing University of Montana strategic plan was one of those, but almost every sector, college, school, department had their own strategic plan that we gathered and analyzed. There were other activities and reports and data that had been gathered by various committees on campus. So that all went into part of our effort to understand the current situation at the University of Montana. So we, once the fall came along, um, we started engaging with students, faculty, staff on campus, and also we engaged with a lot of community members. And so we did that in a variety of ways. We did focus groups, we did listening sessions, we did interviews. We used a tool, an online tool called Neighborland that allowed folks to generate or submit ideas, and then other people to engage with those ideas, either by voting on them, to support them, to commenting on them. These images on the left here show that one of the other things we did is we went to a lot of big campus events like Welcome Feast, Homecoming. We went downtown for a day during First Friday and set up this board that we had where we basically asked the simple question, I want blank, and people could fill in their ideas about what they wanted to see at the University of Montana. And we would take all of that data and we would feed it into this Neighborland tool so that all of those ideas were aggregated in one place, and then folks could, from no matter where they were at in the world, could interact with those and give us some feedback on those. So that was our process. I'm going to talk a little bit more next week when we start into our conversation about co-creation, because I used a different tool just this past year in a process for IT strategic planning that was a little bit more sophisticated than this, and I'll be interested in sharing some of the experiences and outcomes with that as well. So we spent about 5 months in this very rigorous process of trying to understand what is. And I think if there's one thing that our group did extremely well, it was the amount of time and energy that we put into this initial process. In the design thinking phase, this is called the empathy stage, where you're truly trying to understand what it is that your stakeholders want and need. And so at the end of this process, we're now in the calendar year, we're at about December, and we have thousands of pieces of information that we've gathered, some of those quantitative data, some of that qualitative data, and we needed to figure out what to do with that. And so this was really the analysis and synthesis phase. We had some subgroups that worked on things, and then we spent an entire day in a retreat where we, as you can see from some of these pictures, had like summaries of everything that we had gathered on walls. We spent a lot of time taking those ideas and thinking about how they fit together into specific themes and how they were connected with each other, and basically combining those, and then at that point taking a little bit of a break for Christmas. During that break, one of the things that I did is I took all of this thinking that we did in this analysis and synthesis phase, and I created this picture. And you'll see in the readings this week that one of the tools that is talked about in the Designing for Growth book for your process is a tool of visualization. And I think it's really, I've come to really appreciate the power of pictures and the value of pictures, both for helping the thinking process and then also the power it has in helping to communicate more clearly. And so this basically what I did was I just tried to take all of the themes that we had developed and depict how they connected with each other. And so I printed this out on a large poster board. I think it was 4 feet wide by 3 feet high, and we brought it to our next meeting, probably in early January now. And this was sort of the catalyst for talking about the next phase, the what if stage, or in design thinking terminology, that we've kind of defined our problems, and this was the start, or defined our issues, and this was the start of the ideation phase. What were we going to do from here to start to solve some of these issues that had bubbled up through our engagement with our stakeholders? So it was really interesting. I didn't know what the reaction to this diagram would be, but it was I was really incredibly surprised at kind of the conversation that it generated. It was some of the best conversation, the most animated conversation that our group had. And even some of the people on the committee that I think were a little bit reluctant to follow this process. To me, I was pleased to see that they really were engaged by this and they started to see how some of these connections made sense. And in fact, one of the analogies that came out of this conversation that I hadn't really even thought about as I was creating this picture was somebody pointed out that, well, this really is like a small universe, and these bigger orange colored themes are like stars, and the kind of the next larger pieces that are in green are really sort of like the planets that are orbiting those stars. And then the other themes that are around those planets are like moons. And so it really kind of became a neat analogy, and I think it helped people understand that, that there was some gravitational pull, that all of these forces had some pull on other forces and how they sort of tied together. So what we did is basically the next step then was probably about a month-long phase of getting creative and ideating. How would we go about addressing some of the issues that arose in these themes? And so in the end of that process, we came up with a set of 11 what-if scenarios that we wanted to test. We wanted to go back to the community, to the campus, and to all of the people that we'd engaged previously and test our ideas to see how they played with them. We had to figure out how to do that. And so what we came up with as our testing mechanism was that we decided we would create a gallery that we would have in the University Center. We also produced a virtual gallery that had the same information and the same functionality online so that people from a distance could participate. But the basic idea was that each one of our what-if scenarios would have a panel. We would have kind of a title for that scenario, a brief description of it. We would have some documentation that helped people understand where those ideas came from, some documentation in some cases showing where similar ideas were being employed elsewhere, either in higher education or in the for-profit world. And then you can see kind of this middle space here, we have some opportunities for people to provide feedback. So we had just a strip of white paper, and we would give people a set of either of green dots and red dots, and they could either use green dots to stick on ideas that they liked, that they wanted to promote, or if they had some concerns about an idea, they put a red dot on it, and that would be an indication to us that there was something about that we needed to think about. And then we also had, as you can see in this part, we had just very simple blank index cards that people could write comments on and hang them in and become part of the gallery so that other people could then come look through those comments, add to them, add their own comments and whatnot. So we actually, this is what it looked like in real life. We were in the University Center for an entire week from Monday through Friday. So we had someone from our team there 8 to 5 each one of those days. And then we also staffed the area a couple of evenings during the week so that people from the community could come in. We had mirroring in there for an evening. We had a class or two that came in and engaged with the gallery as part of their educational. I think one of them was a graduate class in the College of Education that was looking at strategy, and so that was a nice learning opportunity for them as well. So we did that for a week, and then that really informed kind of our next step, which was, I'll get to that in just a minute. Kind of the next step was then to synthesize all of that information, and what we created from that point was what Rummelt would, I guess, term his guiding policy. We called it our strategic vision, and it really was, even a more scaled down, focused version of some strategic opportunities that we thought the university should consider. And so the next step of that process was, again, more testing. And so we went back out to various groups on campus, in particular to faculty, staff, and student governance organizations. Shared that with them for their feedback. And then we also had 2 campus open forums where we invited people from campus and the community to come and give us their feedback. That generated generally very positive feedback. This was a Missoulian, the front page of the Missoulian, the day that we did that, or the day after we did those open forums. We felt pretty good about the fact that that the reaction was generally very positive. We did get some good positive ink in the Missoulian, which was something that we had been lacking, and so we felt good about that. So what happened next? I mean, one of the challenges, one of the things I want to talk about is what went well with this process and what didn't go so well. I think I'll start with maybe the challenges first. President Engstrom was the one who actually commissioned this process to start. He's the one that put together the team. During the 8 or 9 months that he was, so one of the things that happened, if you're not aware, is that about 8 or 9 months into this process, President Engstrom was relieved of his duties as president, and we had an interim president come in, Sheila Stearns, and she was in that role for about a year. With both President Engstrom and with President Stearns, they were very interested in the process, but they weren't deeply involved in the process. So we kept them posted on what was going on, but they were not fully engaged in both our process and the outcomes. And I guess one of the lessons that I've learned from all of this is that unless you have kind of the full support and the full engagement and the full understanding of the highest level leadership in your organization, you probably are not going to be successful, especially if you're using an innovative and adaptive approach like design thinking that is going to be a little bit new to an organization. I think it's really critical to make sure that that executive director, the president, the chair of the board, whoever those leaders are in the organization, they need to be very clear on understanding what you're doing and really be driving the process for a large part. That they can get help from facilitators and from folks like our strategic planning committee that were invested in this process. But that was definitely an issue that led to some concerns and problems later on. I think a second thing that I learned from this is that we significantly underestimated the amount of resistance that we got, in particular from our faculty governance group. We engaged faculty all throughout the process. I think we felt like we were doing a good job of that. What I think we underestimated really was that our process was more or less undermining or usurping kind of traditional powers and processes that had been used by Faculty Senate. And they didn't really express those concerns to us, but we probably should have been aware of that. And so then when it came time really to kind of sanction what we had done and buy into it, they were not willing to do that. They more or less vetoed the plan, not so much because of the content, but I think more so because of the process. And I think a third thing that really made our process challenging is that midway through this, shortly after President Stearns took over as an interim president, really at the pushing from the Commissioner of Higher Education, we started a process of program prioritization on campus. And so that was looking at every academic and every administrative program and sort of their strengths and weaknesses, and prioritizing the ones that were doing well and maybe we should invest more in, prioritizing the ones that were maybe underperforming and that we could consider either cutting or merging with other programs, those types of things. And so I think that clearly that sapped a great deal of energy and attention away from what we were trying to do with kind of a more visionary strategic planning process. Understandably, with programs and with careers kind of in the balance, human behavior turned to more turf protection as opposed to being more open and collaborative in nature. And so all of those things were somewhat negative but there were some really positive things that I think happened during this process as well. One, I think that the team that President Engstrom put together, I think he did a good job of bringing in some real diverse perspectives and diverse skill sets, and I think giving us the really the power and the impetus to think of what we were doing, not as a political process, but really as a design process. So we had, full power to take this process any way we wanted, and so, we kind of decided early on that, it was much better to design this collaboratively as opposed to, basically fighting over, who got what in traditional governance models. I think it was, I do think that it was valuable to use this process of design thinking, even though it did create a lot of, I wouldn't say backlash, but it certainly created a fair amount of resistance. But that's sort of what this process is about, is that you test things, you try things, you learn from them, and you iterate. And so I know all of us certainly learned a lot from the first trial and error of this. I'll talk a little bit more next week maybe about a second iteration that I did of the design thinking process, and things that I think did actually improve because of what I learned from the first time around. And then I think the third really positive lesson that we learned from this was that, as I said, the enormous amount of time and energy that we put into that empathy stage, the what is stage, paid a lot of benefits. I see, we went through President Engstrom, through President Stearns, and then we were still, sort of going when our current President Bodnar took over back in January 1st of 2018 of this year. And he really launched immediately his own strategic planning process, but he also listened and took in what we had done as part of our process. And it's gratifying to me to see that a lot of what he has released as some of his strategic thinking really does have a very strong foundation from what we learned in our early engagement with people. And so that was well worth the effort, and I think people being engaged, thousands of people being engaged, our engagement going beyond just the traditional campus, but also engaging business people in the community who relied incredibly on the success and well-being of the university. Those things all paid benefits, and so that's one of the things I would say to you as you're thinking about designing your strategic planning processes is don't underinvest in that first process of the investigating and engaging with people and understanding what is. So that's it for this week. There is a fair amount of reading. There's a video on there. I also added an additional optional video that's from back in the year, I believe about 1999 or 2000, that talks about a design company called IDEO and their creative process. It's a very entertaining, interesting look at how they go about designing products. Very much follows the design thinking model. There's a companion book to that I'll share with you as well. That is called I'm forgetting the name of it, but I'll share it on Moodle for you. And so lots of resources. We will get back together again next week, like I said, for one-on-one conversations, and hope you're doing well. Thank you.